Welcome back, class. Let's go ahead and start with a review of session 13.1. In the last video, we conducted an overview of Gestalt psychology. We discussed that the perception is greater than the sensations that it is comprised of. We reviewed some of the antecedents to Gestalt psychology and discussed many of those who supported this anti-Wundtian perspective that Gestalt psychology represented. We also discussed some of the founding individuals for Gestalt psychology, Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler, and the various areas to which they investigated. We also mentioned the idea of isomorphism, the similarity in the Gestalt pattern of a stimulus and the activity in the brain while perceiving the stimulus are similar shapes. We also discussed the law of pragnance. People will perceive and interpret ambiguous or complex images as the simplest form or forms possible. Carrying that idea further as we look at perception. Perception is how we make sense of the stimuli that we receive from the environment around us. But there's also this idea of perceptual constancy. The way we respond to objects as if they are the same even though the actual stimulation on our senses receive may be greatly different. So when we're on the beach and someone's playing around with a big beach ball, one of those huge plastic balls, the idea is that as the ball goes further away from you, as people toss it about, the image of the ball on your retina will change its size. But we do not believe the object itself is changing its size, even though our retina size of the image will indeed change. This phenomenon is not a function of sensation plus learning, but is a function of the ongoing brain activity and the field's activity. So we sort of know that even though the retina image may change, the object itself does not change. Furthermore, when it comes to perceptual gestalten, we have the figure ground and principles of organization to look at. So with figure ground, the perceptual field can be divided into two parts: the figure and the ground. The figure is clear and unified and is the object of our attention. The ground is diffuse and consists of everything that is not being attended to. The division creates a figure-ground relationship, and what is the figure and what is the ground can be changed by shifting one's attention. So we have the example that we've shown in class a couple of times of the old man or the mouse image. Well, we can see an old man, but then if we focus on something else a little bit different, we can then shift from the old man to the mouse. So we're sort of shifting what is figure and what is ground. And you've very familiar with this. You have the old woman, young woman. You have the vase and the faces. All these are figure ground demonstrations showing us that if we shift our perspective somewhat, then our attention changes and the figure becomes the ground and the ground the figure. The other idea is continuity. Stimuli that have continuity with one another will be experienced as a perceptual unit to make a whole. So when there is a preference, we prefer to see things that are continuous, and therefore we'll pick those things out more, and they'll be more vibrant to us in a sense. We also have the idea of proximity, which also discusses in Gestalt ideas. Stimuli which are close together tend to be grouped together as a perceptual unit. So if you look at a bunch of items on, let's say, a bunch of marbles, if there's a group of marbles that seem to cluster together, we'll see that as a unit, a perceptual unit, simply because of the proximity. The same thing can go with us as well. If we have a bunch of people leave together a bar in the middle of the night, someone looking at them will start to see them as a unit, a group of friends possibly, going out on the evening and leaving the bar together. In addition to that, we have inclusiveness. When there is more than one figure, we are most likely to see the figure that contains the greatest number of stimuli. We have similarity. Objects that are similar in some way tend to form a perceptual unit. Let's say you're out in an office park somewhere and you see a bunch of people leaving that are dressed quite similar to one another, you'll probably say they work at the same place or are part of the same club or association because of that similarity in the style of dress. So objects that are similar in some way tend to form a perceptual unit. Then we also have closure. Incomplete figures in the physical world are perceived as complete ones. For example, if we have figures with gaps in them, we will fill in those gaps to make a whole. It's a tendency that we have. We see that. For example, we can have several triangles together going around in a circle, and we will see them connect even though they're not connected. We'll see a star when there is no star. Then we look at subjective and objective reality. Kafka distinguished between the geographical environment and the behavioral environment. The geographical environment is the physical environment. The behavioral environment is our subjective interpretation of the geographical environment. Our own subjective reality governs our actions more than the physical environment. What this is basically saying is this: our perception is our reality, but our perception may not be objective reality or objective truth. So how we perceive things will dictate how we behave, what our actions are going to be. So our own subjective reality is what governs our actions more than the actual physical environment, what is really there. In addition to Gestaltian ideas, we see that Gestalt is not just about things of sensation and perception. There are Gestalt explanations of learning as well, even though we don't hear about them that much. So one of the explanations of learning, we have this notion of cognitive trial and error. Instead of behavioral trial and error, which I'm sure you're familiar with, you try something, it fails, you try it again, it fails, you try, it fails, you try it again, and then you have success. That is trial and error from a behavioral perspective. But Gestaltians also believe that we have cognitive trial and error as well. So organisms can come to see solutions to problems. They test them out in their mind, so to speak. No, that won't work. Try something else. That won't work until, yes, that idea may work. So the notion is that we see this trial and error from a cognitive perspective as well, not just a behavioral one. This leads us to the idea of insight learning. If a problem is presented to an organism, along with whatever is necessary to solve the problem, insight learning will typically occur. Insight learning has basically four characteristics. The transition from no solution to solution is sudden and complete. 2. Performance based on the insightful solution is usually smooth and free of errors. 3. A solution gained by insight is retained for a considerable length of time. And 4. A principle gained by insight is easily applied to other problems. So the notion of insight, which is being able to see or understand something clearly, it often includes having an understanding of a cause and effect relationship, namely, if you do A, then B will happen. So this insight learning, by its characteristics, it can be used for many things. So obviously, performance is based on insightful solution is usually smooth and free from errors. So that is something that we really like to do. We get the idea, the solution, and then we see the solution not only works, it was rather easy for us. And when that happens, we tend to hold on to that for some time. So the success of it is retained for a considerable length of time, so it's in our memory. And then we see that we have this thing easily in our memory, and there's another problem that this could be used for, and we then will do so. This leads to the idea of transposition. An organism learns principles or relationships, not specific responses to specific situations. You may have heard of this saying before. It's better to teach a man to fish than to give them a fish. So think about that for a second. It's better to teach a man to fish than give them a fish. That basically implies that now you have that skill to fish, you can always feed yourself. That's the notion behind that. So once we learn it, once we learn the principle, the organism can then apply it to other similar situations. So once you learn through this insight the way this solution worked for this particular type of problem, well, it sets itself in stone, so to speak, and you can have that available to other similar problems as well. This is very similar to a notion in IO psychology and other HR areas of transfer of training. Similar to transfer of training, where the training that we learned in one area can be transferred to another. We can transfer those skills to something else. Now that introduces the idea of productive thinking. Productive thinking. The ideas presented in the book Productive Thinking by Wertheimer were based on personal experiences, experimentation, and interviews with people considered excellent problem solvers, such as Einstein. A similar technique was sort of employed in a way, if you think about it, from the humanistic perspective of Maslow and Carl Rogers, where they did a lot of interviewing of successful people. Here, we're looking at it by way of how it is that people think, who are been identified as being very successful thinkers, Einstein being one of them. So, productive thinking continued. Learning based on Gestalt principles will be based on understanding the structure of the problem, followed by the solution, and the solution is reinforcing. We'll see more about this in an upcoming chapter on behaviorism, but you guys have had enough classes to realize this. Behaviorism is about reinforcing, particularly operant conditioning. So if we find a solution to a particular problem, that solution being found, that is reinforcing to us. So learning and problem solving are intrinsically reinforcing. So when we learn, as Gestaltans see it, learn these ways, it becomes a reinforcing thing for us as well. Remember what reinforcing is. It basically just says if something is reinforced, we're more likely to use that skill or that technique in the future. So this is a top-down learning in contrast to rote memorization or learning based on logic and typical of most educational systems. So here, from top down, we have a solution to something. We have used it in the past. This is a similar situation. We use it again. It serves as a reinforcing type of thing. And it is very top down. Higher order mental processing here. So that points out another aspect of this, memory. Another aspect, memory in productive thinking. Well, obviously, we have to have our memory working and working efficiently and effectively in order to recall that we've used a particular solution before to a similar type of problem that we can use now again. Let's look at the Gestaltans' perspective on this. Memory. A memory process is the brain activity caused by a specific environmental event. An environmental event occurs, the brain is working with it, and a memory process is said to occur. When the event ends, so does the brain activity it caused. However, a remnant, a memory trace remains in the brain. We also remember things in general terms rather than by specific characteristics. Individual traces give way to trace systems, which is the consolidation of a number of interrelated experiences. So as you're learning this material, okay, and go through various things to learn certain types of material, each one of these leaves individual traces, but they also can be collected together, consolidated to form sort of a trace system, a system of interrelated traces based on your experiences. The interaction of traces and trace systems with memory processes results in our perceptions and memories being smoother and better organized than they otherwise would be, according to Gestaltan views of thinking and learning. So let's revisit some of the ideas and antecedents of Gestalt. We'll just go through some of these somewhat briefly here. Brentano, that we mentioned earlier, he was a teacher. One of his students was Freud. He discussed methods and techniques of doing research in psychological areas. He viewed methods and techniques as not being interchangeable. He also thought about experimentation as only one way to study psychology. We could use non-experimental methodologies as well. Psychology specified elements in human consciousness and the interconnections. He also discussed the idea about the bigger picture of research, that we usually start off with descriptive methodologies and then go try to find out more causal explanations a little bit later. Looking at Ehrenfeld's basically Gestalt quality is proposed that there was an added quality of the whole beyond the individual perception. So the idea here is we can look at this example. Hopefully it clarifies, especially if you know music a lot more than I do. Notes can make up a melody, a sequence of single notes that is musically satisfying, but different notes can produce the same melody. So the idea is that it can produce something different than the things that comprise it. That's the key point there. So we can change elements, but relations between them are unaltered, and that is the Gestalt quality. Okay, that there is something else beyond the things that make something up. So what makes something something? This was mentioned briefly in your text as well. The question is, what makes something something? Well, first of all, matter is matter. We're all made of matter, the same stuff. But the key thing is how it is arranged. May make a dog, or a cat, or you. So the notion here is that all the matter is matter, but there is this other quality to putting this stuff together that makes you a unique individual, or a dog, or a cat. So Gestalt, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Parts are understood only in how the function as part of the whole, and experience is never individual sensations. So let's talk a little bit about Kurt Lewin and Kurt Lewin's field theory, another field theorist and Gestalton. First, let's go to way back and looking at how people view things in the past. Let's talk to our old friends Aristotle and Galileo. Aristotle emphasized inner experiences, emphasized inner essences and categories. Galileo emphasized outer causation and the dynamics of forces. Lewin saw Galileo as revolutionizing science when he changed the focus from inner causation to a more comprehensive notion of causation, in which the behavior of an object or organism is determined by the total forces acting on the object or organism at the moment. This is what gave Lewin his impetus for his field theory. Lewin's complex dynamic forces acting on an individual at a given moment explains human behavior. So taking these ideas, the Gestalton ideas and the ideas that were mentioned by individuals like Galileo in the past, he proposes the following. Lewin proposes the following. Behavior is a function of person and situation. Remember in previous lectures we saw perception is a function or equals to the stimulus in the environment, the physiology of the organism that's doing the perceiving, and then our previous experience, our cultural experience, our education. And that all together equals what we're going to perceive. So remember earlier we saw perception as a result of these things: the environmental stimulus, the physiology of the person, and the person's experience. So here we're seeing somewhat the same idea, that behavior, anyone's given behavior, is a function of characteristics and things related to that person and the situation they're in. So this brings up the idea of life space. This was life space, Lewin's idea of life space. Life space consists of all influences acting on him or her at a given time. These influences, called psychological facts, consist of an awareness of internal events, external events, recollections of our prior experiences. So things inside of us, things outside of us, and things that we remember from prior experiences. To be a psychological fact, it must exist in the person's awareness at that moment. Only those facts that are currently present in the life space can influence a person's thinking and behavior. This basic idea of contemporary things that are at the time where you are in that life space, contemporary to you, the principle of contemporariness in a sense, the life space also contains imagined events. Anything that you have active in your working memory, so to speak, things that you're pulling up from your long-term memory, so to speak, things that you have in your immediate environment that you are attending to, all these things will have an influence on your behavior. Lewin also looked at motivation. So the idea is that biological and psychological needs cause tension in the life space. And the satisfaction of the need reduces the tension. So having these needs causes tension that we have to deal with. These psychological needs are called quasi-needs, he refers to them. But there's also this thing called the Zarnik effect. The Zarnik effect. The Zarnik effect is the tendency to remember uncompleted tasks better than completed tasks. So you have a list of things that are motivating you to reduce tension in your life space. You do one, you do two, you do three on the list, you do the fourth item on the list, but you don't do the fifth item on the list. Later, as you're thinking about things, you recall that fifth item on the list. You may not recall the first four items on the list, but you do recall the fifth. The explanation is this. The explanation was that for an uncompleted task, the associated tension is never reduced. You never got rid of that tension that represented in your life space. The task remains as an intention, and as such remains as part of the person's life space. Thus, we remember the uncompleted task better than the completed tasks. And one other idea, a couple of other ideas that Kurt Lewin did. He's a social psychologist among other things, and I really liked him. Lewin investigated three types of conflict: approach, avoidance, and approach. Let me give you really some quick examples here. This is a graph of a approach. You have had a great semester and they're giving you an award. So you have two awards that you're receiving, and they're both fantastic places to go, but you realize they're on the same day at the same time. So you can't go to both. You would like to. Okay? That's an approach. Two equally attractive goals, but it causes conflicts because you can't do both of them. That's an approach conflict. Then we have avoidance conflict. Let me give you a graphic example here. Somebody wants to kill you. Okay? And so the idea here, you're on the edge of a cliff, and if you fall down the cliff, you're going to die. But the person is really close to you, and they have a hatchet, and they're about ready to hit you. So your choice is, you can go deal with the hatchet death or falling death. Two very unattractive things. Two things you don't want, but it causes a conflict because you got to choose one. That's an avoidance conflict. And then we have an approach avoidance conflict. There is something that you want to do that attracts you to it, but at the same time there's something that you don't like about it. Let's say you like to talk. You like to talk about certain types of things, but you also are very, very afraid of speaking in large groups. But you have to talk about this thing at this really highly populated presentation that you're going to give. So you like the idea of talking about this subject, but you dislike the idea of having to do it in front of so many people. That becomes an approach avoidance conflict. A couple other things. He's very good for group dynamics, was our Kurt Lewin. For Lewin, a group can be viewed as a physical system, and the behavior of that individual elements is determined by the configuration of the existing field of energy. So basically it comes down to this. The nature of configuration of a group will strongly influence the behavior of its members. With group dynamics, Kurt Lewin was sort of unearthing, in a sense, all the multitude of types of relationships and influences that we see within a group. Groups serve certain roles, or individual members of the group serve certain roles, and they are influenced and influence each other. Members of each group has what Lewin called a dynamic interdependence. And you have belonged to groups and teams before, and you realize this, I'm sure. Studies of group dynamics led to such things as encounter groups, sensitivity training, and leadership institutes as well.